Servlets are Java's way of connecting from a web application request to Java code. So the first thing I want to get out there is that a servlet is misconceived as being all about web pages. The servlet itself is actually available for many different types of protocol. And when we talk about servlets, we're not actually talking about the HTTP protocol exclusively. That's what we mean most of the time when people say servlets. But I want you to just be aware of the fact that a servlet's kind of like a plug. You know, I can plug whatever I want to a plug. I can plug in a lamp into a plug. I can plug a clock into a plug. I can plug a computer into a plug. I can plug a cell phone charger into a plug. I can plug a power saw into a plug. I mean, they're all dynamic ways of doing different things. And so what's more interesting is not the appliance, it's what we plug into it. We have to pick the right plug for that. So when we talk about servlets, a servlet's an interface, and underneath that there's this thing called an abstract servlet, generic servlet, then sort of there, and then what we really care about is the abstract class HTTP servlet. That's the one that we really are doing our work in when we say servlet. So when we commonly say servlet, this is what we're referring to. Not a huge deal, it's a lingo deal, just want you to be aware of that as you move forward. So the servlet interface itself is just a request response handler. I get in a request object, I return back a response object. Well, what does that look like? Well, not much. It's generic. We need to get more details on that. So a servlet by itself doesn't help us, doesn't tell us much, but it does give us the foundation where we're going to have a method where we receive information about a request, and we have an object where we write information to about the response. So one thing that's true for all servlets is they are all multi-threaded. So we talked about socketing. We talked about that as an internet protocol. Now we're talking about threading as also something being able to take care of by our web server. So whether I have one computer or two computers or 1,000 computers, each request gets its own thread through that servlet object. So we have one servlet object, and it is by very nature multi-threaded. It doesn't make a big difference to us, except for the fact we don't have to write thread code. But we do have to be aware of shared objects and all the different things we'd have to worry about when we're doing multi-threading. So the HTTP servlet is actually a customization then of that main servlet. When I want to deal with information from a servlet, I have to deal with one of these methods: get, post, head, put, delete, trace, or options. These 7 methods form the foundation of the hypertext transfer protocol. The protocol itself has these 7 things. It was designed around letting you getting files, putting new files out there, asking for information about files, deleting files, or otherwise managing files. It was basically a big file management system out there that we have cleverly used the get and post on. We don't really use the rest of them for the most part to be able to manage websites, pages, text going back and forth. Well, when we get into web services, we'll see we actually do use delete and put a little bit as well, but for the most part we just use get and post, particularly in the web frontier. So here's an example of a servlet. Quite simply, I have my servlet extends out HTTP servlet, and inside of there I'm realizing the method doGet. Now this means that anytime somebody makes a GET request to a page, and that's basically when you just go visit a page, this is the code that will get called. If somebody posts to this same servlet, then nothing will happen because we didn't implement that code. But inside of the code, to be a servlet, I extend the servlet. And then I provide a request response method, doGet, and inside of there I can do whatever I want to. I can do literally whatever I want to. Any Java is legal there. If I want to put response back to the browser, then I go to the response object and I use this getWriter method, and then I get from that the printWriter. And from the printWriter I can do just like I did in I/O, print lines. In this case I'm printing formatted HTML, and then I go through and can close my servlet. And then I'm done. And this does not get printed in my application. It gets printed onto the browser. It gets put into the stream, which gets sent back to the user to get put on their browser. And so it would put a H1 tag out there, hello world. Now the H1 wouldn't show up because it's HTML. It would put this in the format of heading that was there by default for the browser because I'm attaching an additional style to it. So I replace the doGet method, I implement it, and write whatever I want back, and that's a servlet. Now, it doesn't handle form data. To handle form data, we have to add a little bit extra features looking at that request object. So within the form data then, the most common way we get this data is through the HTML form tag. So here I have a form that posts somewhere. I have select boxes. I have input buttons. So this is a drop-down box. It's basically one thing I can do: selling lemonade, cleaning store, opening store, closing store. The 4 drop-downs that happen inside of here, and the data comes to us as key value pairs. So for the key task, I get one of these 4 values that gets sent to us. And so the key inside of a servlet is I have to get the parameter out of the request object. So you can see right here, the request object says, get me the parameter from task, and it returns me a string, which is whatever task was selected. In this case, I can print it back out. It's going to be one of those text values: clean, sell lemonade, clean store, open store, close store. It's going to come back here. It's kind of a time tracking application we have going on. And so as simple as that, we can get that data, but it comes back to us just as text. If the form didn't have something called task inside there, I wouldn't have gotten anything back. So part of being a servlet is understanding the design of the page and mapping to that design of the page. I have to be very careful that my HTML aligns to my Java. When I say task over here, I have to ask for a parameter task over here. When I say ID over here, I have to ask for it over here. The text has to be spelled the same. Capitalization doesn't really matter so much inside of there, but we have to be careful that we don't have multiple things over on the HTML, because then on Java I'll get multiple fields and then it'll be confusing and not work. So a lot of our work in servlets would be to align to make sure the data we're hoping to get and the data that we do get are actually the same thing, because that's where the magic comes in. That's where the trick comes in, is getting these two things to align. Now, past that, that's about it for a servlet. Everything else is just straight Java code. The trick is not so much the logic inside of your application. The trick is putting a response back to the client, being able to render back HTML. And that's what we'll find out later on when we get into Java server pages, the flip technology of servlets.